Okay, and we are live. This is the 21st episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, and joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back once again. A couple of them this week, so happy to have you if you're here or listening later.
Yeah, our second episode this week, and this afternoon, we are joined by our special guest, Alex Smolen. Thank you for coming on. Alex, can you say hi, everyone?
Hey everyone, how's it going? My name's Alex. I'm at Al Smola at Twitter and GitHub.
Yeah, and we're going to post links to Alex's website, Twitter, and GitHub in the show. We've got some other links regarding some of Alex's work that we're gonna dump into Slack as well as YouTube as we go. And just to briefly introduce Alex, he currently works at Clever, and that is a technology startup in San Francisco. It brings SSO to K-12 classrooms. He's an engineering manager for the infrastructure and security teams there. Prior to Clever, I like the description you use, Alex. What was it? You protected the bird, or
defending the bird, protecting the bird. There was a lot of like bird analogies and themes that we used, and I'm kind of glad that they're no longer part of my vocabulary.
Well, I mean, you did a good job. I know Neil and Justin worked for you, I believe, on the team there at Twitter.
Yeah, we worked together. I think none of us wanted to be manager. None of us drew the short straw, and had to manage the team. So yeah, we worked closely, and we knew each other before that. As a matter of fact, I'm the one who kind of convinced them to join me up there on the security team. And miss those days when we all work together, but we still keep in touch.
Yeah, definitely a stellar team. If I was gonna build a team, especially to secure like Ruby on Rails stacks as well. Great team. So I know you worked at Foundstone as well. You did consultant work there.
Yeah, that's right. I did application security consulting, so secure code review, web application penetration testing, threat modeling, and also I was our social engineering service line lead.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, that's
usually you don't cross those two over too much, right? The social engineers, the developers don't really get out and aren't as good as that.
I think for whatever reason, I guess I was in enough my high school plays or something like that where I thought, hey, this sounds like something I could do. And without a ton of training, I sort of taught myself about the different techniques that people use to achieve various goals when doing social engineering. And it was a lot of fun. I spent time trying to break into various different buildings and call up people and ask them for their passwords and send out phishing email campaigns. And it's a fascinating way to sort of spend your time thinking about how you can trick people into getting them to do what you want.
Mm-hmm. No, that's cool. I mean, it obviously it's become more of a kind of like a siloed business or a different business line for most consulting companies. Like when Ken and I were at Fishnet, like it was always kind of the penetration testing team or the network pen team that would do that as an add-on. But I see firms now that specialize in social engineering, right? I mean, obviously you got your phishing companies that do that, but that's just pretty interesting. So how long did you spend at Foundstone? Like how long were you a consultant there doing AppSec stuff?
I was there from I think something like 2006 to 2009, so about 3 years. And
Okay.
took a short break to kind of work on a startup that never actually panned out. But yeah, all told, 3 years in the consulting arena.
That's not too bad. I mean, that's enough of an introduction to all things consulting. I know I was talking with Neil about it because you worked with Neil when he came on to Fishnet, but I think he only ended up staying like 4 months. He noped out of the consulting role pretty quick and back into the industry. But
yeah, it's not for everyone. I think
no.
that you have to have a certain mindset to appreciate sort of solving a bunch of different problems for people, and then the next week you are sort of back to square one. But I think there's a lot of really amazing things that I learned while I was consulting. You're able to see such, especially when you're doing something like threat modeling and you're talking to organizations that have software teams that are hundreds or thousands of people. You see things and you learn in this very compressed time frame about the just all the different ways that software gets built in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Right? Sometimes it feels like the square one, but you definitely get a wide exposure to different technologies, different ways that people are approaching it. Usually the bigger companies are the ones that can afford to bring in consultants. So you are seeing large networks, large applications, but that's not always, it's not always the case, but it usually is. So, I mean, it sounds like you've wandered a little bit from your AppSec days at Foundstone. Since then you've been doing infrastructure security as well. What do you feel like is your sweet spot? What is it that you enjoy doing the most? Just kind of give us a rundown on that.
Yeah, I think that when I think about like what my personal mission is with respect to security, I think that security is the cause of a lot of suffering in our world. From
Oh no, I think we lost Alex.
We just lost him.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, vamp.
Yeah. So he's back. Okay.
That's, I think, something that we're all pretty intimately familiar with in the community, people who are practitioners and think about these problems every day. I think the part of my mission that is maybe a little bit sort of uncommon, or at least I like to remind people that this is really important in our day-to-day work, is the suffering that the protective measures that we build can sometimes cause as sort of a side effect. And so, to me, it's really important to always think about, sort of the broader picture of what it means to implement security in a system, and to think about the human factors, to think about the implications of what we build, and to not sort of only view one side of the trade-offs that we make when we build security mechanisms into systems.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen your work and watched your talks, and you always, what I like is that you always have like empathy focused or based solutions for securing, like for instance with AWS, like part of your talk at LocalMocoSec, which I'll go ahead and link. You gave like a nice, here's my concern about keys being stored all over the machine. And then here are some pretty neat solutions that are like low friction to deal with that. That seems to be like just what I've caught from, that seems to be your focus. I don't know if that's an accurate way to describe it, if you would describe yourself like that.
Yeah. What I tried to do with that talk at LocalMocoSec was talk about the fact that identity and access management is this field of engineering that is designed around stopping people from doing things. And if those systems aren't designed carefully, they end up maybe leading to a secure system, but maybe also leading to a system that people find painful to use, that is inefficient. And my belief is that you can find these optimums in the trade-off between the way that a system is designed with respect to making it usable and making it sort of robust to user confusion and things like that, and also having it protect against real threats in the world. And so, for example, with the part of my talk where I talked about AWS access keys, I think that there are tools you can use to make access keys harder to steal. But those tools, if not configured correctly, can also make it hard to develop and lead to confusion. And so what's the right way to pick from sort of each side of the equation and find the best approach? And I tried to describe what I thought was sort of a configuration that had this optimum balance of security and usability.
Yeah, and I did post the link to your talk, and I think the solution is described, the one you're talking about halfway through the talk. But don't skip through. You want to see the whole thing. It's great. I loved all the Terminator references in that talk.
Yeah, that was a really, I look back on why I decided to make the talk half about the movie Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And if you haven't seen the talk, you probably are scratching your head and wondering why that would even be the case or how that would even work. I think I wanted to make something that was primarily entertaining, I suppose. I really think that when you go to a conference, you see so many talks in a row that it's very easy to get lost in sort of this technical detail that someone is super passionate about, but after hearing about someone's super passionate technical detail for 8 different talks in a row, it all starts to blend together. So I wanted to figure out a way to kind of be a little bit I guess zany, just sort of not necessarily focus only on the technical challenges, but also think about sort of some of the kind of bigger metaphors that I've found entertaining personally when thinking about security. So yeah, I guess you'll have to see it to really get it. Hopefully it hangs together. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out.
Yeah, no, I mean, the imagery and the metaphors really tie in well in that talk and do make it stick, at least for me. So I think mission accomplished there. So I was going to ask you, because one thing we always like to ask folks who join this podcast, but we're just getting to it a little bit later in the show, was, we talked about places you've worked. We know you've gotten a master's degree from Berkeley. You've done some really great things. But what I'm curious, and Seth's curious, we're all curious, what got you kind of thinking about security? What got you into the security space? And then just kind of expanding from there on your origin story, because everybody seems to have a different path to InfoSec or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, can you please tell us about yours?
Yeah. I started programming when I was a kid. I remember sitting in the public library and reading a book about BASIC, the programming language, and typing the commands into the computer at home, and writing screensavers in high school and stuff like that. But it wasn't until I graduated and I had my first job as a software engineer that I, thought about having a professional career in security. And the way that it happened was my first job out of college was at a company that built software testing tools. So, things that would like look at your Java code and automatically write unit tests for it. And one of the things that they were hearing in the market that people wanted was not just quality, but they also wanted to verify the security of their software. And none of the products did that. And the CEO of the company was this pretty eccentric dude who came up to me, this lowly engineer who had just come out of college, and sort of pointed at me and said, "You're in charge of this. Figure it out." And it's kind of weird to think that that's really where it started. But I was really interested in what at the time was this burgeoning field of application security. This was around 2005, and I was learning about application security online and thinking about what different problems we could find in code. And I ran across the OWASP website, and some of the early projects like WebGoat and WebScarab and these projects that kind of like demonstrated sort of the top 10 of the day. And it really fascinated me to think that all this stuff was out there and that there was this knowledge that just not everyone had, and that we could not only sort of demonstrate our power by like making these unexpected things happen, but also then safely show people the way to to being enlightened and to understanding how to protect themselves. So I started to interact with the community, specifically around OWASP, and in that day and age, there was the OWASP Orange County chapter and also the OWASP Los Angeles chapter. I think they've combined into like a SoCal chapter, but and that's actually how I met Neil and Justin back in the day was through that OWASP chapter. And I also met some other people who were influential in my career, and one of them hired me on to work at Foundstone. Even though I had only a couple years of security experience, I went on to kind of do this application security consulting, and that's what led me to where I am today.
It's funny because when we talk about how to kind of break into security if that's your interest, we talk about going to conferences, going to meetups, inexpensive conferences, obviously, not something that's super pricey, but yeah, like meetups and just networking makes such a big difference when it comes to breaking into the field, just knowing somebody. And I do feel like, I don't know, good folks such as yourself and, everybody starts to connect and those relationships last. And it's kind of like, you're saying you brought Neil and Justin into Twitter. It just keeps swapping back and forth. It seems like that throughout your security career. If somebody's dependable, you try to bring them in,
Yeah, now that GitHub is acquired by Microsoft and SurveyMonkey's going public, I wish they'd bring me over there. That's a favor or something.
So it's a little late to those bandwagons, right? You wanted it before they announced. You'd hope that people like Ken would say something, but no, all that insider knowledge, it just never seems to translate, right?
Hey, I found out through Twitter
the same way we did. Yeah,
exactly. So yeah, that's that. It sounds like, well, first of all, it's funny to think that back then somebody just dumped security. Like that's just they just said, oh, it's like a side thing. Now it being what it is, it cracks me up that like what. I mean, if you don't want to date yourself, I understand, but how roughly, far back was that?
So that would have been, yeah, like 2005, 2006, and that will date me a bit, but I also feel like a little bit of cred, I guess, just because, so many of the challenges back then are the same as the challenges are now. There were very early tools for doing dynamic scanning and for static analysis, and people were aware of like threat modeling concepts and secure software development lifecycle concepts. None of those things were as well understood by as many people and as comprehensive or sophisticated. But ultimately, so many of our challenges continue to be the same. And it's layer upon layer, we're getting better at doing things like making sure that you have an SSL connection with the right cert, or that you don't have a cross-site scripting problem in your code. But in general, I think that to see things kind of continue and to understand that the best indicator of what we're going to see next is just what we've seen before, but just kind of like the next iteration of it. That's been kind of satisfying to me to see throughout these years.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Both Ken and I probably came up around the same time, maybe me a little bit earlier, but the whole iteration, I'm really interested this initial period, this couple of years that you spent, actually developing something into a QA tool, right? Like I've always said, coming from a development background, I feel like security is just a bunch of glorified, QA testers, especially on the application security side, right? And so was that a product that ever got released or anything like that? Is it something that you can talk about, or is it, should we just leave it and move on?
No, we sold it. It was sort of like an extension to our existing tools. And, there's a funny story about so there was this tool that we had that would allow you to sort of record web browser interactions and replay them to sort of verify functional tests. And what I did is I built a sort of extension to that would, like, at various points when it saw like a form during these interactions, it would start throwing, single quotes and all sorts of garbage there to see if it could identify anything in the response that suggested that, there was a vulnerability in the application. And this was, some Java app, single threaded. I'd gotten these lists of attack strings from who knows where on the internet and, sort of shaped them to whatever I thought made sense. And, it was my first business trip. We flew out to Jersey City. I was with a salesman at the time. And we went to this insurance company that I was told had like the second largest database on the East Coast or something. And they wanted to test an application that connected to it. And so they set me up in a cubicle, and I was wearing a tie because you had to wear a tie. And I kind of clicked start on this tool, and I watched it run. I saw some like exceptions popping up, some like 500 errors, and I was like, huh, that's interesting. And then all of a sudden my phone rang, or like the desk phone rang. And it was my point of contact there, and it's like, whatever you're doing, stop it right now. And apparently it had been generating enough stack traces that like the logging system had sort of started to overflow, and it was slowing down everyone else's traffic around this really mission critical database. And I was scared to death. I was just still a young buck at the time, and didn't necessarily understand like that I wasn't going to get reprimanded or anything. But when I got back, my CEO was so happy. He's like, they're scared shitless. You did it.
Yeah, you probably didn't appreciate at the time what an awesome thing you just did.
Yeah.
Yeah. No SQL injection. It was just, they had, bad error handling and unstable software, but whatever it was, it worked. And, so, Yeah. I think that those things have evolved and are still part of some product line somewhere, but it's been many years. And, I think that I learned, during that era, a great deal of respect for people who go about building, scanning tools or static analysis tools. It is a very, very difficult task. And it is so difficult, in fact, that I have very little trust in these products in general, and tend not to recommend them to people when they ask. So,
yeah, that's just it, right? We start talking about automated analysis and false positives, and how often the tool output still has to be manually verified, right? Like, and you especially learn that as a consultant, because you've got to defend any finding that you put in front of somebody. And it's very easy to just take that report and dump it straight to your format and give to a client. And at that point, they come back and say, oh, well, I'm not seeing that same behavior, right? So defending something that you aren't sure is 100% of vulnerability becomes a difficult thing to do. I don't know. The days that you're talking about initially being a consultant, as some of those static analysis tools were really, that was kind of, starting as they were ramping up, right? Your Fortifys, your Ounce Labs, or whatever it was at the time. Now the AppScan Source, and even some of the other ones that are still out there. But initially that was it, right? PCI came out, right? I'm sure you remember this, and everybody's like, oh, you have to do static analysis or dynamic test of your application. But that compliance checkbox did not equate to security, right? Not even close. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I just think it's interesting that to hear you have been on that side of actually trying to build those things, because every once in a while we seem to step back and think, oh, well, we could just build this into a scanner really quick, and don't realize the effort that goes into it, right?
I don't know why every couple of years you get that bug and then you realize, oh, this is why I haven't done this. Never mind.
yeah, I think
2 days into it,
like idealism in that, like, you could build something that will find every problem, and I think you as soon as you are like, okay, that's a terrible idea, and you start from scratch, and you're like, well, maybe there's certain things we can automate, and then like you build some tooling to just find a very, very simple class of problems, and I think, to me, like, that's super valuable. And I think that you see a lot of people who work in the software security space think about how to build or take some of the things that we've learned kind of from like the like the way that people have evolved towards continuous delivery, and like delivering sort of stable, robust software from a quality perspective. And like some of that same stuff makes sense for software and software security. I just think that it can be really difficult to translate that into a product because every organization develops software so differently. And your incentive when you create a security product is to show as many things wrong as you can. And I think that there's just an incentive to not accurately portray the risk, and to not even be able to portray the risk effectively, because the context of every organization is different. What is meaningful to one organization might not be meaningful to another. And so I just I'm skeptical of products, not because I think that the people who design and build and market them don't know what they're doing, but just because I know that it's a really difficult thing to do.
Yeah, and I mean, to add to what you're saying, some of the teams that I've either seen, talked to, or been a part of that I would consider to be full of really, really competent like AppSec folks who are doing some really cool things are not if there is a scanner involved, it's like it's already been fine-tuned and customized to begin with by that team, but it's one of many tools, and it's certainly not at all a very important piece of the day-to-day workflow. It actually is like becomes a pretty minor aspect of all of the things defense from a defensive perspective that you actually care about. So, meaning like more important things might be asset management or being having a flow for important or sensitive like pull requests or code changes, various things like that you could think of that just don't necessarily not like a scanning is not a crutch. It's not something that is all as important as you would think. At least I did before I did the defensive side. From the offensive side of things, obviously scanners play a big part of like our day-to-day workflow. I mean, and obviously automation. Sorry, manual testing is a big part of that, but you have to do your due diligence using automated tools. So I don't know. I apologize. I'm going off on a tangent there, but yeah, it's just I've never found them to be like super useful as well, for what it's worth. So on the line of tools, though, or along the lines of tools, and I know it's a weird transition, but I did want to ask about CloudTrail Daily, and let me post the link to it in chat. But I did want to ask you to tell people more about that tool that you're working on.
Sure. So Clever is based or uses AWS, and I've learned a lot about how AWS works and how to think about securing it. And the talk that I gave at Loco Moco Sec was focused on 3 different projects that I wrote about that relate to AWS IAM, or Identity and Access Management. And one of the things I talked about was CloudTrail logs. And if you're not familiar with CloudTrail, it's one of the AWS services, one of the many that start with cloud, terrible naming, but CloudTrail is the sort of audit log for who did what in your AWS environment. And by default, those logs are delivered to CloudWatch, so another cloud service.
Lots of clouds.
Yeah. And most people will then ship them out to some sort of system, whether it's Splunk or their own Elk stack, or various different ways of managing sort of like security related logs. And be able to alert on them and sort of have their own proprietary way of dealing with them. And I've been really interested in like what's the best way to make sense of these logs, because I think that they're really important for understanding like what's going on in your environment, both from the perspective of finding indicators of compromise, but also from the perspective of making sure that your services have least privilege, that users have least privilege, and that just like no one's doing anything weird. Like, did someone decide to start using a new service in a new region, and like you're like, no, don't do that. Like, just the insight that it gives you is, I think, really, really important. And I don't think that there were good enough tools that allowed you to understand in summary what was going on in your AWS account. And so the inspiration behind this CloudTrail Daily tool, which is still a bit of a work in progress, but it sort of it works. I have ideas for extensions, but it works. Is that every day you have a group of subjects that access your AWS account. And when I say subjects, that could be either users or roles or federated users, but basically like some sort of identity of something that is accessing your AWS account. And then for each of those, they access different services: S3, Dynamo, EC2, all the sort of cloud star, AWS services. And then for each of those different services, there's a set of actions that they can be taking. So maybe they're, creating tables, or maybe they're, reading network interfaces, or, just all the different sort of actions in the IAM permission model. And And what I thought is that, these CloudTrail files, you can forward them to S3, and they just sort of sit there as these big blobs of JSON. And I'm like, wouldn't it be cool if you could just summarize them? And so this tool is just a command line tool built in Go that sort of downloads your CloudTrail files from S3, parses them to find, like, if there's duplicates, it's like just sort of consolidates them, and it also parses out, like, is this a role? Is this a federated user? Like who is this? And kind of groups everything together so that you can see at a glance who accessed what. And so you just kind of pass in an account number, a date, and it gives you this summary. I think this is really cool because it, to me, gives you the building blocks to start to ask interesting questions like, hey, like, what did people access today that they didn't access yesterday? Or, for this particular role, who assumed this role and what did they do when they assumed it? I think that answering those questions is doable in like Splunk or any of these other tools. But, my hope is that you can kind of like cut out a lot of the cost and expense of maintaining an Elasticsearch cluster and having to sort of run these queries manually. And I thought that it would be a good way for people who are kind of maybe just getting started with using CloudTrail to get some value out of it. So that's the spiel. Yeah.
No, it's useful. I mean, I've done a few talks where I walk through setting up like CloudWatch and using config and then CloudTrail and then tying it all together and then using Splunk and just like different sources. And like the thing that you touched on is that there's no coherent approach, one coherent approach. There's no like to do alerting, to run these queries. It's not, it's like very custom for as many customers that are using AWS as there are, it seems odd that it is so pieced together and customized per user, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that, AWS is, they're releasing new stuff every day, it feels like, but there's still so many gaps Oh,
did we lose Alex?
I don't know.
Oh, I think we lost him again.
Yeah, I mean, what he's talking about though is like, I always find it pretty interesting that there are definitely gaps, right? I mean, AWS is moving so quickly. Just while we wait for him. Oh, there you go, Alex. You're back now.
So we lost you where you said there are gaps.
Yeah. So I think that there's, to me, it's a great opportunity to not have to worry about so much of the infrastructure that you need to build, amazing products. But you also can't, if you just tell, people who are engineers and who are working operations to just like go to the AWS console and like figure it out, I feel like they're gonna not be super happy with you. I think that kind of smoothing out the corners and optimizing the sort of control planes that people interact with to work sort of well with what your organization does. To me, like that's I think why a lot of the things I've been working on lately around security have been less focused on like sort of identifying problems in application code and more about building infrastructure tooling that engineers use to sort of get these like force multipliers in security, where like you build this tool that engineers can use to have better security insight, to automatically have least privilege. It's sort of going deeper into the framework, going to a deeper level. I think that's an area for opportunity right now. So.
Yeah, and it's really, it is very interesting to actually look at different organizations and their maturity level based on their infrastructure tooling, right? You know, a lot of big operations that you walk into, you can tell how seriously they take security and development in general by how reactive they are to problems, right? When you report a security bug, what happens? Especially if it's critical, does, you know, everything come to a screeching halt, or do they have a process to actually handle that? Do they know where their logs are? Number one, do they know what's being logged? Who's accessing their AWS account? Right. That's, you know, all of those things, like the tools like you're writing here, like CloudTrail, definitely make it easier for someone to approach that, because it is very difficult, right? All of us, you know, had that first time that you looked at the Amazon AWS console and just went, holy crap, what am I supposed to do in here, right? And I can't imagine what, you know, somebody like a developer that, you know, only works on, you know, Java Spring code all day long, and they tell them to go into AWS, what they're going to do with that.
Yeah, and
right?
I think that you want to, you know, one of the great things about all these tools is that people can go out and build quickly, and you know, they have all these like fantastic resources at their fingertips to spin up, you know, huge data stores, and to, you know, have GPU instances optimized for all these different tasks, and, you know, lambdas, and like all these different tools that they can use. And I think that it's our responsibility as people who want to, you know, enable secure development, to not necessarily shy away from slowing them, or not shy away from these challenges by trying to slow them down and say, you can't use this, you can't use that. But instead to like make sure that we have the appropriate insights, that we have the appropriate controls to make sure that these things are being used safely. So, you know, I think it's one of the things that is tremendously challenging about security, but it's also, you know, sort of very satisfying, is that, like, you know, you're constantly being moved forward by technology. You know, if you're working in an organization that cares about using the latest, greatest, then you yourself have to care about that and understand it in order to be relevant and, you know, sort of meet people where they're at in terms of addressing security challenges.
I mean, I'm definitely seeing more application security centric background type folks get AWS certifications, be involved with AWS more. It's interesting that, you know, primarily code, well, you know, infrastructure is code. So nowadays with something like AWS, so it is interesting to see that shift. I mean, is it, because I know you have a security team and an infrastructure team. Is that sort of your introduction to AWS, is leading and managing those teams, and then working with this product stack?
Yeah. I mean, I'd run some stuff personally, but it's not like I am, you know, sort of, I guess, a fanboy, or for lack of a better term, right? Like, you know, I think that there's like other cloud services that have a lot to offer, and, like, you know, I think that you know, there's a lot of amazing work going on in the Kubernetes community right now, and, like, you know, Azure has a lot of cool stuff that they've built, and
Microsoft plug.
I mean, I used to be a what was it called, the you know, MVP, Microsoft MVP. You know, I was teaching ASP.NET security classes, and I'd go to Blue Hat, and, you know, I for some amount of time I knew a lot about .NET security, and you know, it was very interesting to me, and I think that, you know, because what's fascinating to me is again the real world. What are people using? You know, where do people need help? And, you know, whereas a lot of ASP.NET websites were being built in, you know, 2007, you know, these days there's just a tremendous amount of people who are, you know, relying on AWS, and so that's, I think, why I find it fascinating to kind of think about those security problems that come with using it, and you know, there's other people out there who are doing great work, and you know, I hope to just kind of be another voice in the conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that, because, well, the as far as .NET and all that, about 2007, 2010, that was like, if you had that sort of certification, that sort of background, you're golden. Like that was, I mean, obviously a .NET's still used, right? But that was the golden era of like having that background and being an AppSec. That was a pretty sweet little deal you had going there. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's I'm glad that I don't necessarily have to remember all of the intricacies of the web forums and MVC and all that stuff, but yeah, there's clearly still a lot of things being built with Microsoft development tooling, and yeah, it's I think it's just for me. It's sort of like a relic of my consulting days, right? Like you learn, and but you try to remain flexible. And I think that right now what's really fascinating me, is just the challenges that AWS and sort of sane AWS organizational controls entail.
Well, like I had said in the beginning of this, before we started the podcast, and like we always say, an hour goes by real quick. So we've chewed up so much. We've already gone through so much time, and I definitely know that we wanted to have you just kind of explain the WebAuth and spec, because we want somebody who's at least toyed with it a little bit to explain it to folks, and just give your thoughts on it. But any benefits you see and stuff like that. So yeah, we're picking your brain.
Yeah, sure. I is kind of like a disclaimer. WebAuthn is a standard, an emerging standard that I haven't necessarily read in detail. It's just something that caught my interest, and I spent a few weekends playing around to see if I could get it to work on my computer. And I was able to, and I thought it was really cool, and I want to kind of hype it, I guess. So if you think about sort of the evolution of authentication evidence online, people are pretty used to the idea that you would have a password. People are pretty used to the idea that you might be able to reset that password through your email using a link with the token that's in your email. You may be familiar with the ability to either reset your password or to do a two-factor authentication with a code that's sent to your SMS. And you may have seen other forms of authentication, things like something in a native app on your smartphone that allow you to kind of verify an authenticated session through your native app. Things like U2F, which is like a hardware token that allows you to verify your identity. And WebAuthn then builds off of U2F, and it's sort of like the next generation. And there's a ton that I don't understand about it, the intricacies of the protocol and things like that. But what I do understand about it, I think, is the benefits over the existing U2F solution. So U2F is awesome for a couple reasons over like just a traditional SMS-based authentication, because it uses these hardware tokens that are, sort of keep the private key on the token, so the private key never leaves the token. And they're also registered in a way where when you pulse them, like the authentication evidence can only go to that site. So they protect you against phishing as well, which is a big problem with two-factor. If a site just asks you to enter a code, like someone could be playing man in the middle, right? But U2F devices help protect against that. So the WebAuthn spec allows you to actually a couple things that I'm aware of. One, it allows you to use these hardware tokens without having to necessarily have a username or password. So you can imagine you go to a site and you pulse your key, and it automatically logs you in. Now, that said, you can imagine all, what happens if someone steals it, things like that. But again, it's just a way, when you start to work with authentication, you start to sort of see these, rather than seeing like, oh, like there's one true way to do authentication, you should have two-factor with this and that. It's like, no, actually what makes sense is like you have all these different forms of authentication evidence, and then contextually, the site decides what risk level you're at and sort of asks you to provide one of those types of evidence. And the more flexibility you have in the way that you provide that evidence, sort of the more, power you have to design experiences that align with people's expectation, that lower friction. And so I think it's a good thing. Also, there's the ability to not necessarily just use hardware tokens, but to also have things that work like on native apps on your phone. So making that idea of not just necessarily using SMS-based authentication, but having cryptographic material that's on your phone that allows you to assert your identity is part of the spec as well. And so it's an emerging standard. Last I checked, when I was working on it, it's supported in Firefox Nightly and Chrome Canary. You can go to webauthn.io to try it out if you have a U2F device, like a YubiKey. And yeah, it's awesome.
I love the piece that I love the description about authentication that you described there, because it is typically, I think, in a very basic sense, thought of as you're either authenticated, you've either provided us legitimate credentials or not. And you're right I think it's a very accurate description to say now we look at authentication more as, like you said, several different things being provided, context, and then deciding, like the legitimacy of your access from there. I think that is something that, if nothing else, to take away from like these conversations we've been having over the last few episodes about authentication. That's a really nice thing to take away from that. So, and thank you for describing you're messing with WebAuthn, because you've done more with WebAuthn than either Seth or I. So you've at least got it running on your machine. So
yeah, I mean, it's common in the future, because again, I think it's really promising.
Yeah. So I mean, so at that point, just to dig in a little bit, so WebAuthn itself, you're authenticating basically kind of to your browser. Is that the case? And then the browser is presenting that, or how does that actually happen? Or what is the identity provider there?
Yeah, so it's it's basically a from what I understand, it's like a browser standard, right? And it's a way of a browser to sort of pass authentication evidence off to a site.
Okay.
So there's like
the browser is kind of
UI pattern for like saying, please pulse your key and stuff like that. Yeah, I think honestly what it comes down to is I just bought a bunch of YubiKeys and I'm like, I want to like get my money's worth, and like they do some things well, but like I'm always hoping that, it's the dream, right? Like I would love to be able to rely on them for more and more authentication tasks, to be able to SSH with them, to be able to do standard TOTP based 2FA with them. Like, and I've been trying to get a lot of this stuff to work. A lot of it is very sort of unsatisfying in terms of the end experience, but WebAuthn, I think, is the real deal.
Okay. No, yeah, it'd be interesting to play with, but where it is so emerging right now, I can't see myself necessarily trusting using or passing out Firefox's nightly build to people just so they can use their YubiKey, right? That becomes a supportability question. As we were talking about the usability of security, right? The way that we can make it easier for users and developers to use. It's difficult to push something until it's been adopted kind of across the board. So
I think it's very promising, and especially considering all the challenges we have with authentication right now. There's just I think a lot of excitement and hype kind of around this spec. So
yeah, and I think that in general, the the problem with getting any new authentication technology out there is that it's not a unilateral decision. There's multiple types of groups that all need to kind of coalesce at the same time. And so you have, browser makers, and, you need to have sites that accept this type of authentication. And then you need to have, people who are willing to go and buy these tokens. And so, if it were just a single, if it was just the Chrome team that said, we're going to do this now, like, we would have done it 10 years ago and passwords would have been a thing of the past. But like, you have so many different groups that all need to kind of come together at the same time. And, all it takes is one of them to not adopt, and the technology never happens.
I've heard that it's the hardest thing with specs is just dealing with, because you have corporate interests, which always cloud anything, right? When it comes to building protocols, this company A and B might be totally on board, and then company C is, it's not in their best interest, or they just want to develop their own version of it that's their own proprietary thing. So they sit there and listen to the meetings.
Apple? Oh, what? Yeah.
I wasn't gonna call them out, but yes. So they sit there and listen to
one of the holdouts from WebAuthn, and there's from my understanding, and again, I'm not deeply involved in the standards process, I'm not on the mailing list, but like from my quick reading, it appears that Chrome and Firefox and even Edge and it are all sort of like building this out in their release trains, but like Safari is kind of notably absent, and we'll see how it goes. I'm cautiously optimistic that we're gonna find something that, at least at a corporate level, like I would be very happy to issue YubiKeys to everyone here at Clever and be able to use them more frequently. But right now, there's just very limited use cases for them, and I think that hopefully over time we're able to find better protocols that allow us to sort of achieve more of the things we want to achieve.
Awesome. Well, yeah. So I was going to ask, since we're hitting about an hour here, one thing we always like to ask is, hey, are you speaking anywhere? Is there anywhere that, even a meetup, whatever, that people can come and talk to you or see you speak? Do you have anything coming up that you'd like to talk about?
I don't. Locomocosec was kind of a, sort of coming back from retirement type thing for me for speaking about security. I haven't spoken about it for a long time. Apparently they're already planning for next year, and I'm gonna, beg Jim and Neil to have me back, maybe talk about, I don't know, look who's talking to and how it relates to firewalls or something. I'm not sure. Anyways, I would say Locomocosec 2019 is probably the best shot at me talking about security in the near future. So.
Awesome. Seth, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask or mention?
Yeah, no, I mean, we didn't necessarily dig into kind of your your tool selection, right? When it comes to security tooling, what is it that you look for or you use personally that you find useful?
So I can talk about some of the security products that I like.
Let's go with that. Yeah, that works.
I think 1Password is it's a product I like. I actually got to meet the founder of 1Password at Locomocosec, which was really cool because I was actually just complaining about 1Password, to the team, and then I realized that he was the founder, and I felt a little bit guilty. But I
remember you coming up and saying that. By the way, I remember you actually at the conference you mentioning you're like, yeah, I was complaining, and he's right.
But he was super cool about it, and I think that it's a company that is thoughtful about how users interact with passwords and tries to present a sort of user first experience. So I think 1Password and all the stuff they're coming out with 1Password for Teams and stuff like that is awesome. And I think like if I was, you know, at a startup and like the first dollar I spent on security would probably be on something like that. I think that there's like a lot of the like Objective-C tools, SEE, like for Mac, so like the Knock Knock and Block Block, and they build a lot of these like very sort of like basic but also very powerful anti-malware tools for Mac. I think OS Query and the whole ecosystem that's growing up around that is awesome, and you know, it's just really cool to see. I know I'm forgetting stuff.
I saw somebody on Twitter say, I didn't really understand the context. I mean, so this probably means nothing to you or me. They said something like, repeat after me, OS Query is not a security tool, which I didn't understand because, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a way to effectively query and log significant, important security data. So I wasn't sure, like, I mean, maybe I have got that wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you know, people like to say provocative stuff. I think that
Wait, on Twitter? What Twitter are you on? Never mind.
Yeah, you know, it's maybe sometimes people overstate their point, but you know, OS Query is a tool that gives you insight into sort of what's going on your computer, and you know, one of the reasons why I'd imagine you say it's not a security tool is because it actually, like, at least the default version of it doesn't actually like block anything. It just gives you insight into what's running. So, you know, to me, like, I guess one of the things that I really hate about security products, or like really rubs me the wrong way about security products, is when they're very vague about like what threats they protect against and how they protect against them. And the thing I like about OS Query is that it is something that, you know, you get full insight into exactly what you're looking at, and you can sort of start from ground principles about like, this is what the behavior I want to, you know, enforce, and here's how I'm going to enforce it. And, you know, there's very little magic. There's very little like, you know, secret, like, trust us, we're going to use AI to, you know, none of that. And so yeah, that's why I think that's a really cool tool. I also think that there's good stuff coming out in like the MDM community, things like Fleetsmith that like make it easier to get, you know, sort of insight and control over assets and organization. And I'm just playing around right now with AWS's WAF, which I like used to talk mad shit about WAFs. I think a lot of people in the application security community did. But, you know, I think that like as soon as you introduce the idea of like saying, okay, well, like this is an architectural component that you can code against and like develop your own custom rules and things like that, it's a very powerful piece of software. So those are some of the things that come off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's others.
Did you say AWS's WAF?
Yeah.
Have you tried Signal Sciences at all?
Oh, no, I have not.
I've only seen demos, so I was just curious if anybody comes on and they have that experience, I'd be curious to ask what their experience was. So cool. It's just so AWS WAF is pretty. So when you say code against it, are you saying, or code up rules? So I haven't looked at the AWS WAF. Do you code your own rules and then just plug that into the AWS WAF? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So like you can define your own rules. So like, let's say you wanted to implement an IP blacklist, right? You know, maybe on a traditional WAF, you'd like type in the IPs that you wanted to blacklist somewhere in some console. Maybe even there's some like awesome machine learning thing that they have to learn which IPs are bad and automatically block them. But like AWS WAF, like they have like a CloudFormation template that you can deploy that will automatically read your LB logs, see all the IPs. You can define the rate at which you want to blacklist an IP, and then, you know, in a Lambda, it will automatically append that to the AWS WAF rule. And it's just something that like is very much like a Lego in a Lego world, which to me makes it much more useful than something that you kind of have to treat as a separate software component to manage the operations of.
Yeah, which then usually means that you've got to have some operational component of your company helping to get it integrated, and that becomes overhead for more than just your team. And I can see why that's nice, that it's just there. It's just something you can plug in, and it doesn't take a ton to introduce it. I could totally see the benefit of that. So that's cool.
Yeah. Plus now we're PCI compliant, right?
Now you've checked
that's
box.
all it takes.
Yeah. Actually, and Ken Toller mentioned earlier on the compliance front that in the chat that compliance requires SAST and DAST, but there's no mention of support staff. There's no mention of staff required to sort of review those results and manage the tools and whatnot. So just an interesting compliance thing.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, well, that goes back. Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that goes back to kind of the other tooling that you were talking about building, Alex, is the maturity level of the organization and how easy it is to actually do some of that. It would make it's better for a team if they can, but compliance has never been security, right? What were you gonna say?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, like, I think one of the really difficult things is, it's hard enough to say things about your own security. Having to like figure out how to have other people attest their security is just, I feel sorry for the people who have to think about this stuff all day and really are trying to sort of create meaningful systems where you can have insight about other people's security, and it's something that we start to see the challenge here at Clever with, like, hey, we want to use a new vendor, like, how do we know whether or not they meet our security requirements? Or we want people to onboard with this application. And I just think that it's one of those things that seems easy at first. You're like, oh, like, we'll just read their privacy policy, or maybe we have a security questionnaire, or maybe we'll check if they're PCI compliant, or if they're SOC 2 or whatever, all these different things. But I think just in reality, like, at a conceptual level, that problem is so much more difficult to solve than in your organization are secure. Just the information asymmetry that exists in our organizations, it's such a challenge for us.
Yeah, and that goes across the board. It's not any one organization. Everybody's trying to figure out how to ascertain risk of third parties and fourth parties, and it's a huge problem for sure. Right? But there's no good way to do that, right? And then it's like it falls into all the different silos, right? We're very specific on application security, but as soon as you step outside that box, just because they're doing app security well doesn't mean that they're doing infrastructure or network security like they should, right? So,
yeah, it's a tough job.
Tough job. That's why we're not in compliance, right? I guess. I don't know.
No, we're not. I'm not in compliance because that's too much reading now. It's too many standards.
Too many standards.
Yeah. I'm not gonna follow those rules. No, but yeah, compliance is what it is. Yeah, I don't think we have to get off on that tangent.
No, we don't necessarily. Yeah, Alex, though, it's been great having you on, man. We've been going for over an hour at this point. Is there any final thoughts that you have that you'd like to share with people? Or recommendations for getting into the industry, anything along those lines?
Yeah, I think I just want to, always sort of represent my bias, which is towards users, and understanding that not everyone thinks about security the same way we do, and that the more we can recognize our bias as security practitioners and try to design things that work for everyday people who just want to live their lives, the better off we'll all be. Yeah, that's I strongly believe that, and I want to sort of preach it to other people.
Good. We'll throw that up as the tagline for the episode then, right? You know, think about securities, or not everyone thinks about security like you do.
Yeah.
I mean, we should all know that at this point, right? You know, the amount of questions that I get about printers versus security, right? You know, from the non-security folks is pretty high. So.
Yeah, you still get people who work in security who will, you know, say that anything you do that isn't, you know, up to their very high standards is, you know, a waste of time and you're destroying the world. And, you know, so I want to make sure that we always have that perspective.
Oh yeah, there should always be some balance, and then, you know, be realistic. But yeah, thank you again for coming on. Seth, before we jump off, I did want to mention to the viewers that for those that I had addresses for, well, I shouldn't say, I'm not claiming any credit. My wife went and dealt with the USPS, the post office. She got those things mailed out, so big credit to her. I know the next thing on our list is to we were talking about designing some t-shirts and stuff like that. So let's see what in terms of next week, let's see, we're back. So we are so next Tuesday we will have an episode. Jimmy Mesta will be joining us. Alex, you know Jimmy, right?
That's right. Yeah. I'll be on the other side of the screen for that one.
Yeah. Well, last time we had him on, he got hammered with questions about Kubernetes and container security. So we expect, like, it was so much that we kind of just had to like end the episode and say we're going to do this again, because it was really, I guess Kubernetes and container security is just something that people are right now. It's one of those things that people are just a little uncertain of, and like what product to use and what route to go. So for whatever reason, that's a I guess a big topic on people's minds. Anyways,
hashtag trending.
Yeah, it's definitely a trending thing, a trendy thing right now.
Yeah.
But was there anything else, Seth, that you wanted to mention?
No, I do know that the registration for AppSec USA 2018 in September is up. Ken and I are giving a training on code reviews, how to conduct a secure code review, you know, the approach that we use. So if anybody's interested, hit us up, or, you know, visit the AppSec USA site. Otherwise, man, yeah, Alex, it's been great talking to you.
Yeah, don't go anywhere.
Sure.
We're
don't go anywhere quite yet.
Stay on. We'll end the podcast, but stay on. We just chat with you for a second after to thank you and all that. So, yeah, Seth, anything else?
Nope, not from my end. Thanks everybody for listening today, or listening whenever you happen to get a hold of the podcast. We'll talk to you all next week.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Alex.